Dance alone, the Duke ordered his wife before the entire court. Perhaps humiliation will teach you the obedience marriage could not. The orchestra struck its first note. Eleanor remained motionless beneath the chandeliers, her emerald skirts gleaming like armor, while nearly 300 guests waited for her to break. Only an hour earlier, her husband had signed an order transferring her household authority to Lady Beatrice Harcourt, the woman who had accused Eleanor of stealing relief money from starving tenants. Richard had refused to inspect the accounts, refused to question the dismissed steward, and refused even to examine the silver ledger clasp Eleanor now held beneath her gloved fingers. The clasp had been cut, not broken. "Your Grace," the conductor said, uncertainly, his bow trembling above the strings. "Continue," Richard commanded. The music swelled through Ashbourne Palace. Whispers followed it, like rats behind a wall. Eleanor saw Beatrice standing beside her husband in a gown of pale gold, occupying the place traditionally reserved for the Duchess of Ashbourne. One of Eleanor's household keys hung from a ribbon at Beatrice's waist. Richard must have given it to her after signing the transfer order. That key opened the linen rooms, the wine cellars, the servants' records, and the small accounts chamber where Eleanor had kept 6 years of tenant receipts. A week earlier, Eleanor had still believed the missing money could be explained. She had managed the relief fund since the winter floods destroyed farms along the northern boundary. Her father, a solicitor who had represented merchants and widows, had taught her to read contracts before she learned to dance. Under Eleanor's supervision, grain had been purchased below market price, rents had been postponed, and 27 families had remained on their land. Every payment had been entered twice, once in the estate ledger and once in the numbered receipts issued to the tenants. Then £900 disappeared. The main ledger showed Eleanor's authorization beside every withdrawal. 3 servants claimed they had seen her enter the accounts chamber after midnight. Her silver clasp had been found beside the damaged strongbox. Richard had looked at the evidence and chosen the explanation that protected his pride. His wife had deceived him. He had never asked why a woman controlling the accounts would steal money and leave the only object engraved with her initials beside the lock. Eleanor slowly removed her hand from the clasp. "If your Grace wishes me to dance," she said, her voice carrying farther than the music, "then I shall require a partner." Richard's expression hardened. No honorable gentleman would offer himself to a woman accused of robbing hungry families. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others watched eagerly. Eleanor turned toward the line of noblemen bordering the floor. Not one stepped forward. Some owed their tenants' survival to her relief fund. One had praised her work before Parliament only 2 months earlier. Yet public gratitude was fragile, and a duke's displeasure could close every drawing room in London. Beatrice leaned close to Richard, though she spoke loudly enough for Eleanor to hear. Perhaps her Grace has finally discovered that rank cannot purchase loyalty. Eleanor looked directly at her. "No, but stolen keys can purchase access." Beatrice's fingers immediately closed around the ribbon at her waist. The movement was small, almost invisible, but Eleanor saw it. So did Richard. For one fleeting second, doubt crossed his face. Eleanor recognized the moment in which he might have asked Beatrice why she was carrying the key before the household transfer had been formally announced. He might have stopped the music, summoned the steward, or ordered the accounts chamber sealed. Instead, wounded pride won. "Begin the dance," he said. Eleanor drew one careful breath. If she obeyed, the court would remember a ridiculous woman circling an empty floor. If she refused, Richard would call it proof of guilt and send her from Ashbourne before dawn. Either choice had been designed to destroy her. Then a boot struck the marble staircase. The sound cut through the orchestra. One violin fell silent, followed by another, until the waltz collapsed into a final uncertain note. At the top of the grand staircase stood Nathaniel Ashcombe, Richard's younger brother. A murmur passed through the room. Nathaniel had not attended a ball since returning from the peninsula 7 years earlier. A cavalry explosion had left a scar along his throat and, according to the family, taken his voice. He lived in the Western Wing, refused visitors, and communicated through brief written instructions delivered by his valet. Many guests present had never seen him. Tonight, he wore black evening clothes without medals or ornament. One hand gripped the railing as he descended, but his gaze never left Eleanor. Richard stepped away from Beatrice. "Nathaniel, return upstairs," Nathaniel continued downward. Each footstep seemed louder than the last. The guests parted when he reached the ballroom floor. Eleanor noticed the stiffness in his right leg and the pale line above his collar, but there was no uncertainty in his expression. He walked directly to her and bowed. Then he offered her his hand. For 7 years, Nathaniel had hidden from music, crowds, and conversation. Now he stood before the entire court, asking the disgraced Duchess to dance. Eleanor placed her fingers in his. Richard's face darkened. "I forbid this." Nathaniel turned toward his brother. His hand tightened around Eleanor's, not possessively, but in warning. When he spoke, his voice emerged rough and painful, as though every word had been dragged across broken glass. "She did not steal from you." Shock moved through the ballroom. Beatrice went perfectly still. Richard stared at the brother he had believed incapable of speech. "What did you say?" Nathaniel reached inside his coat and withdrew a folded tenant receipt stained with mud. Eleanor recognized the number before he opened it. Receipt 43 belonged to Thomas Bell, whose family had supposedly received £50 from the relief fund. The estate ledger claimed Eleanor had authorized the entire amount, but the receipt in Nathaniel's hand recorded only 10. Nathaniel looked at Richard, then at the key hanging from Beatrice's waist. "You gave her the authority," he said. "You signed the false accounts. You punished every servant who questioned them." His eyes returned to his brother. "She did not steal from you, Richard." "You did." Before Richard could answer, Beatrice pulled the key from its ribbon and fled toward the accounts corridor. Eleanor released Nathaniel's hand and ran after Beatrice before Richard could issue another command. The ballroom erupted behind her guests, shouting, musicians abandoning their instruments, servants pressing themselves against the walls as the two women crossed the portrait gallery. Beatrice's gold skirts flashed around the corner leading toward the accounts corridor, and the key in her hand struck the stone panels with every desperate step. "Lock the outer doors," Eleanor called. Richard's voice followed hers almost immediately. "No one leaves the palace." It was the first useful order he had given that evening, but Eleanor felt no gratitude for it. Beatrice reached the accounts chamber first. She thrust the key into the lock, twisted it, and disappeared inside. Eleanor arrived seconds later and seized the handle, but the door had already been secured from within. Smoke began slipping beneath it. "She is burning the records," Eleanor said. Nathaniel came beside her, breathing hard from the run. Richard followed with 2 footmen and struck the door with his shoulder. It did not yield. "Bring an axe." "There is no time," Eleanor said. She knelt and studied the lock. The accounts chamber had been built by Richard's grandfather after a steward embezzled rents during the American War. Its oak door was reinforced with iron, but Eleanor knew the room better than anyone. She had spent years working there, while Richard attended Parliament, hunted with neighbouring gentlemen, or travelled to London. Behind the tapestry, opposite the door, was a narrow speaking panel once used by clerks to pass documents without admitting petitioners. Eleanor tore the tapestry aside and pressed the concealed brass catch. The panel opened no wider than her hand, but hot air and smoke rushed through it. Inside, Beatrice was feeding papers into the fireplace. "The receipt boxes," Eleanor called to Nathaniel. "They are on the north shelves. Break the window from the courtyard and remove them first." Nathaniel nodded and turned away. Richard caught his arm. "You will tell me how you obtained that receipt." Nathaniel's scar tightened as he forced out his answer. "After we saved the proof you refused to examine." He pulled free and continued toward the courtyard. Eleanor looked through the panel again. The main ledger lay open on the desk, but several pages had already been torn from its binding. Beatrice lifted another bundle toward the flames. "Those are tenant records," Eleanor said. "Burning them will not make you Duchess." Beatrice spun toward the panel. Her face, so composed in the ballroom, had sharpened into something frightened and ugly. "You should have danced when you were told. You should have learned how accounts are kept, before attempting to falsify them." Eleanor watched Beatrice's gaze shift toward the ledger. That single glance confirmed more than any confession could have done. Eleanor had recorded every relief payment with 2 references, a tenant receipt number and a grain delivery invoice. Altering one book could create suspicion, but it could not erase the trail unless the receipts and invoices were destroyed as well. Whoever had planned the theft knew enough to target the accounts chamber, but not enough to understand that Eleanor never kept all 3 records in the same place. Her father had taught her that after a warehouse fire ruined a merchant's only set of books, copies of the grain invoices remained with the miller in the village, and each tenant possessed a receipt matching Eleanor's private index. Beatrice had risked everything to burn incomplete evidence. "Why are the withdrawals all recorded in round amounts?" Eleanor asked through the panel. "Real relief payments include cartage, storage, and weighing fees. Your figures contain none." Beatrice's hand froze above the flames. Richard stepped closer to Eleanor. "What does that mean?" She did not look at him. "It means the person who altered the ledger understood theft, but not distribution. Beatrice told me you had simplified the entries, and you believed her because the explanation allowed you to accuse me before your guests." Richard's jaw tightened, but he offered no denial. He had received his first warning 3 days earlier, when Eleanor asked him to compare the steward's monthly totals with the grain invoices. He had refused because Beatrice had already persuaded him that his wife was attempting to conceal her own dishonesty. He had possessed the authority to delay tonight's announcement. He had chosen spectacle instead. A crash sounded from inside the room. Beatrice had overturned the oil lamp. Flames spread across the carpet, cutting her off from the door. Her expression changed instantly. "Richard!" she screamed. "Open it, please!" One of the footmen returned with an axe and began striking the lock. Smoke thickened beneath the ceiling. Richard reached for the tool, but Eleanor stopped him. "The door opens inward. If the burning cabinet has fallen against it, force will not be enough." "Then what do you suggest?" "The service passage." He stared at her. "There is no service passage." "There is. I discovered it when I reorganized the archives during our first winter here. You dismissed the survey as household trivia." Eleanor crossed to a wooden panel at the end of the corridor and pressed 2 carved leaves simultaneously. A narrow door opened onto a dark stair. Richard looked from the hidden passage to his wife as though seeing a stranger. "How many secrets does this house keep from me?" "None," she answered. "You simply stopped listening to the person who knew them." Eleanor took a lamp from the wall and entered the passage. The route descended 6 steps, turned beneath the corridor, and emerged behind the accounts chamber shelves. Heat struck her face when she released the inner latch. Beatrice stood trapped beside the desk, coughing, while flames climbed the curtains. Eleanor wrapped a heavy wool cover around her and pulled her into the passage. Beatrice struggled at first, then collapsed against the stone wall. "The ledger," she gasped. "Save the ledger." Eleanor looked through the open panel. Half the book was burning, but on the floor beside it lay the silver clasp bearing her initials. The object Richard had accepted as proof against her had somehow returned to the very room where it had supposedly been discovered days before. She covered her mouth, crossed the smoke-filled chamber, and retrieved it with a pair of iron tongs. Nathaniel appeared at the shattered courtyard window as Eleanor returned to the passage. He had already passed 2 receipt boxes to waiting servants. "Get out," he said, his damaged voice barely carrying above the flames. Eleanor retreated and pulled the panel closed. In the corridor, Richard caught Beatrice as she emerged, but she immediately clung to his coat and pointed at Eleanor. "She locked me inside. She set the fire when she realized Lord Nathaniel had exposed her." Richard looked at the woman trembling in his arms, then at his wife, whose glove was blackened with soot. For one terrible moment, Eleanor saw the old weakness return to his face, the desire to accept whichever explanation demanded the least admission of his own failure. Then she opened the tongs and dropped the heated silver clasp onto the stone floor. "If this was found beside the strongbox 3 days ago," she asked, "why was Lady Beatrice carrying it tonight?" Beatrice's tears stopped. Nathaniel entered through the open door holding the rescued receipt box. "She was not carrying it," he said. "Someone placed it there after the fire began." He set the box down and revealed a strip of dark blue fabric caught beneath its brass hinge. The cloth had been torn only moments earlier. Richard looked at Beatrice's golden gown, but Eleanor recognized the fabric at once. It belonged to the uniform worn by the Duke's private secretary, the man who had prepared the transfer of authority and who had vanished from the ballroom before Nathaniel reached the bottom of the stairs. Richard sent 4 footmen to search for his private secretary, Mr. Silas Vale, while the remaining servants carried Beatrice to the blue drawing room under guard. The guests were ordered to remain in the ballroom until every exit had been checked, but Eleanor knew Vale would not attempt to leave by any obvious door. For nearly 12 years, he had managed Richard's correspondence, arranged his travel, controlled access to his study, and prepared every document placed before him. He knew Ashbourne Palace almost as well as Eleanor did, and unlike Beatrice, he understood exactly which records could ruin them. "Seal the accounts corridor," Eleanor told the housekeeper. "No one touches the burned ledger, the receipt boxes, the clasp, or that fabric. Record the name of every person who enters." Richard turned sharply. "You no longer command this household." The words silenced the servants. Eleanor looked at him through the smoke that still drifted along the ceiling. Her green gown was stained with ash. One glove had burned through at the fingertips, and her lungs ached from dragging his favoured companion out of the fire. Yet the order transferring her authority remained legally intact, because Richard had signed it before witnesses. "Then command it yourself," she said. "But if another piece of evidence disappears, tell your guests it vanished because your pride mattered more than the truth." Richard's face tightened. Nathaniel placed the rescued receipt box on a marble table between them. "Do as she says." His voice cracked on the final word, and blood appeared where the old scar crossed his throat. Eleanor reached instinctively toward him, but Nathaniel shook his head. Speaking caused him pain. Silence had been a necessity, not a mystery cultivated for effect. He took a small notebook from his coat and wrote quickly. "Vale used the Western Passage during the war years." Richard read the message twice. "That passage was sealed after the roof collapsed." Nathaniel wrote again. "Vale told you it was sealed." Eleanor remembered the expense entry. £40 paid for masonry repairs, authorised by Vale and approved by Richard. No builder's invoice had ever accompanied it. She had marked the omission in the household accounts, but Vale had explained that military engineers working at a nearby barracks had completed the labour privately. Richard had accepted the story because Vale had served their father and appeared incapable of dishonouring the family. "The Western Passage reaches the old library," Eleanor said, "and the old library connects to the carriage court." Richard looked toward the corridor. He could already be outside the gates. Not if he is carrying what he came to retrieve. Eleanor lifted the strip of blue cloth with the tongs. The tear ran diagonally across the weave, and a small line of pale dust marked one edge. It was not ash. She rubbed a trace between her fingers and recognized the chalky texture. Ledger paper is stored dry. This dust came from plaster. Nathaniel understood first. He turned toward the western wing. Vale had not planted the silver clasp and escaped. He had passed through a damaged wall or concealed opening nearby. The evidence against Eleanor had been prepared in advance and stored inside the palace. Richard ordered 2 footmen to accompany them, but Eleanor refused. "If Vale hears a group approaching, he will burn whatever remains or take a servant hostage. Nathaniel and I can enter through the library. You should question Beatrice. You are still my wife. I will not allow you to pursue a desperate man through hidden passages." Eleanor met his gaze, without raising her voice. "An hour ago, you ordered that same wife to dance alone before the court because you believed her a thief. Do not pretend authority has become protection merely because your accusation is failing." Richard flinched as though she had struck him. Nathaniel opened the service door and held the lamp toward her. Eleanor followed him without waiting for permission. The western passage smelled of wet stone and old timber. They moved through darkness, while sounds from the palace faded behind them. Nathaniel's limp worsened on the uneven floor, but he refused her arm until they reached a collapsed section where fallen bricks narrowed the route. There, he stopped and pressed one hand to the wall, fighting for breath. "You need not speak again," Eleanor whispered. He opened his notebook. "I should have spoken years ago." She read the line, then looked at him. "About Vale." Nathaniel nodded. Beneath it, he wrote, "About Richard, about what he becomes when fear is praised as judgment." Eleanor did not ask him to explain. There would be time for old wounds if they survived the present danger. They continued until the passage ended behind a shelf in the abandoned library. Eleanor found the latch, eased the panel open, and entered a room coated in dust. Moonlight crossed the floor through tall windows. No one appeared to be there, but a candle still burned on the writing desk. Beside it lay Eleanor's private account index, the one she kept locked inside a drawer in her bedchamber. Vale had taken it before the ball. Nathaniel closed the hidden panel behind them. Eleanor approached the desk without touching anything. Several pages had been copied in another hand. The copied numbers were not payments, but receipt references, arranged beside the names of tenants whose farms bordered the proposed northern canal. This was never merely theft, she said. They selected which families would appear to have received money. Nathaniel pointed to a map beneath the papers. Red ink marked a continuous route across the northern farms, ending at land owned by Lord Harcourt, Beatrice's father. If the tenants were accused of participating in the fraud, Richard could evict them for dishonesty. Their leases would return to the estate, allowing the canal route to be sold without negotiation or compensation. The missing relief money had financed a scheme to dispossess the very families it was meant to save. Eleanor studied the map and saw a signature at the bottom, Richard's signature. He had approved a preliminary canal agreement 6 weeks earlier, though he had told Eleanor the proposal was abandoned. Vale had placed the document among routine correspondence, and Richard had signed without reading beyond the first page. Eleanor heard the click of a pistol behind her. "You always did understand the accounts too quickly," Vale said from the doorway. He wore a travelling coat over his torn blue uniform, and a leather case hung across his shoulder. "That is why Lady Beatrice could never replace you. She was only required to make your husband hate you long enough for him to sign." Nathaniel moved in front of Eleanor. Vale aimed the pistol at his chest. "Do not attempt heroism, my lord. Your brother has already provided every authority I require." He removed a folded paper bearing the ducal seal. "By dawn, the northern tenants will be arrested for conspiracy. Their farms will be seized, and the Duchess who protected them will be confined as the architect of the fraud." Eleanor looked at the date beneath Richard's signature. The order had been signed that afternoon, hours before the ball. Her public humiliation had never been intended merely to punish her. It had been designed to ensure that when the arrests began, no one would believe her warning. Eleanor did not look at the pistol. She kept her eyes on the leather case hanging across Vale's shoulder, and noticed that its lower corner bulged around something square and rigid. A document case would bend under that weight. A metal seal box would not. "You forged the withdrawals," she said, "but you could not forge my private index without entering my bedchamber." "Lady Beatrice gave you the key." Vale smiled. "Lady Beatrice gave me many things. Her usefulness, however, is nearly finished." "Then you planted the clasp in the burning room to silence her as well." "I planted nothing." His denial came too quickly. Eleanor remembered the silver clasp glowing against the floorboards and the strip of blue cloth trapped beneath the receipt box. Vale had entered the chamber through the western passage while Beatrice burned the ledger. He had intended the fire to destroy both the evidence and his accomplice, then place Eleanor's clasp where it would be found a second time. If Beatrice died, Richard would believe Eleanor had killed the only woman capable of defending his accusation. If Beatrice survived, panic would make her appear guilty. Vale had arranged a victory whichever woman emerged from the flames. "Move away from the desk," he ordered. Nathaniel remained between the pistol and Eleanor. Vale cocked the weapon. "Your loyalty to the Duchess is touching, my lord, but rather late. Where were you when your brother stripped her authority? Where were you when his guests called her a thief?" Pain passed across Nathaniel's face, but he did not move. Eleanor saw what Vale intended. He needed Nathaniel angry enough to advance, giving him a reason to fire. "Nathaniel," she said quietly, "step aside." He turned his head a fraction. "Trust me." Slowly, he obeyed. Vale's pistol followed him, then returned to Eleanor. She placed both hands where he could see them. "You said the arrests begin at dawn, but the order is invalid. The Duke's signature and seal are both present. His signature authorizes the detention of tenants named in the attached schedule. There is no schedule attached." Vale's gaze dropped involuntarily toward the folded order in his hand. Eleanor moved at once. She seized the heavy map weight from the desk and hurled it not at Vale, but at the tall library window behind him. Glass shattered outward into the carriage court. Vale fired. The ball struck the bookshelf beside Eleanor, showering her with splinters. Nathaniel drove his shoulder into Vale's chest. The two men crashed against the desk, overturning the candle. Eleanor smothered the flame beneath the map before it could reach the copied accounts. Vale struck Nathaniel's wounded leg and tore free, but Eleanor caught the leather strap across his shoulder. The case opened between them. Papers spilled across the floor, along with a square iron box bearing Richard's ducal crest. Vale kicked Eleanor's wrist and escaped through the hidden panel, leaving the case behind. Nathaniel started after him, but his leg failed beneath him. Eleanor caught his arm before he struck the floor. "Let him go," He has lost the seal. She picked up the iron box. Its lock had been forced, and inside lay the smaller matrices used to stamp Richard's private correspondence, estate warrants, and household orders. One space was empty. Vale had escaped with at least one seal, but not the large matrix required for land conveyances. He could still issue convincing instructions to servants and local officers, but he could not complete the canal sale without returning for the missing instrument. Eleanor crossed to the broken window. Two stable boys in the carriage court stared upward. "Ride to St. Matthew's Church," she called. "Tell Reverend Hale to ring the flood bell 3 times. Then, warn every northern tenant to gather at the church and bring their relief receipts. Go now." The older boy hesitated. Mr. Vale ordered the horses kept inside. "Your Grace, Mr. Vale has fled with a pistol after attempting to murder Lord Nathaniel. If anyone prevents you from leaving, tell them they obstruct the Duke's lawful inquiry." She did not know whether Richard would support those words, but the boys ran for the stable. The flood bell had not sounded in 2 years. Every tenant understood its meaning. Immediate danger, abandon sleep, gather at the church. Vale might still send constables north, but he would no longer find isolated families waiting in their cottages. Eleanor returned to Nathaniel. Blood darkened his sleeve where a splinter had cut him, though the pistol ball had missed. He tried to stand and nearly fell again. "You protected me at the cost of your leg," she said. He took out his notebook, but his hand shook too badly to write. Eleanor knelt beside him. "Do not apologize for 7 years of silence tonight. What you did in the ballroom gave me time. What you did here gave those families a chance." His gaze softened, then shifted toward the scattered papers. He pointed to one, partly concealed beneath the desk. Eleanor drew it out. It was a statement prepared in her name, confessing that she had diverted the relief money to bribe the tenants into resisting the canal. At the bottom waited a blank space for her signature. Beside it lay a physician's letter, declaring that Eleanor suffered from nervous delusions and should be confined for her safety. The letter was dated the following morning. Vale had planned not merely to arrest the tenants, but to force Eleanor's confession before having her declared incapable of managing her own affairs. Richard arrived with 2 armed footmen moments later. He saw Nathaniel on the floor, the pistol mark in the shelf, and Eleanor holding the false confession. "Where is Vale?" "Inside the western passage," she answered. "He still possesses one of your private seals. Send men to guard every exit, but do not allow them into the narrow passage. He knows it better than they do." Richard took the confession and read it. His face drained of color when he reached the physician's letter. "I never authorized this. You authorized the arrests. You transferred my household authority. You allowed Vale to prepare documents without inspection. He built his final lie from the powers you willingly gave him. I did not know what he intended. You did not wish to know." Richard's eyes closed briefly. From the eastern side of the palace came the first distant toll of St. Matthew's flood bell. Eleanor counted the 3 measured strokes. Her warning had reached the village. For the first time that night, one part of Vale's plan had failed. Richard moved toward the window and saw riders crossing the moonlit courtyard. "You saved the tenants." Eleanor gathered the copied accounts and placed them inside the abandoned leather case. "I delayed their arrest. Saving them will require proof." Nathaniel pointed toward a sheet bearing columns of numbers. Eleanor examined it and recognized her own calculations for grain storage, copied precisely but labeled in Vale's handwriting as canal expenses. Her work had been used to conceal his theft. Richard looked over her shoulder. "These figures are yours." "Yes, I reduced storage losses by 12% last winter." Vale took the method, changed the headings, and used the result to justify payments to companies that do not exist. Richard's expression shifted from shame to anger. "Then this proves he stole the money. It proves someone reused my calculations. A skilled advocate will say I did it myself." She turned the page and found 3 company names: Northmere Surveying, Bell and Cross Transport, and Harcourt Navigation. Each had received exactly £300. "We need the bank drafts, the original invoices, and witnesses who saw who collected the funds." Richard straightened. "I will summon Vale's clerk." "You dismissed his clerk last month." "At Vale's recommendation," he admitted. Eleanor remembered the young man. Samuel Price. Quiet, precise, and terrified on the morning Richard accused him of copying private correspondence. He had denied it. But Vale produced a letter in Samuel's handwriting. Richard dismissed him without wages or reference. Eleanor had secretly given Samuel enough money to return to his mother's cottage near St. Matthew's Church. She had protected him before knowing he might become useful, because abandoning an innocent servant without food had been wrong. Now, he was gathering with the tenants under the flood bell. Samuel Price may have seen the drafts, Eleanor said. Richard looked at her sharply. He left the county. No, I paid for his lodging after you cast him out. You acted against my order. I acted against an injustice. Richard's mouth hardened. It was another moment in which he could accept the truth and stand beside her, or defend his authority, because admitting error wounded him. Before he could choose, a footman rushed into the library, carrying an envelope. Your Grace. This was found pinned to the Duchess's chamber door. Richard broke the seal. Inside was a single line in Vale's handwriting. Withdraw the warning and sign the confession before dawn, or Samuel Price will hang for the murder of Lady Beatrice. From the corridor came a woman's scream. Eleanor reached the blue drawing room first and found the guard unconscious beside the open door. Beatrice was gone. On the carpet where she had been lying, someone had left Samuel Price's blood-stained knife. Eleanor did not touch the knife. It lay upon the pale carpet, with its narrow blade darkened by blood, and the initials S.P. carved into the wooden handle. Samuel had used it for trimming quills and cutting sealing cord when he worked in Vale's office. Half the household would recognize it. Vale had selected the object precisely because it connected an innocent man to the room without requiring anyone to witness a crime. Richard knelt beside the unconscious guard and pressed 2 fingers to his throat. He is alive. Eleanor examined the wound above the man's ear. The skin had split where a blunt object struck him, but the blood on Samuel's knife was nearly black and already drying. This blood did not come from the guard. It was placed on the blade before the attack. Richard looked toward the open service door. Then Beatrice may still be alive, or Vale wants us to believe she is. Nathaniel entered behind them, leaning heavily upon a cane a servant had brought from his rooms. He pointed to the carpet near the window. A faint trail of ash crossed the blue wool, ending at the concealed door. Vale had carried Beatrice through the same network of passages he had used to reach the accounts chamber. He could move inside Richard's house more freely than its master, because Richard had trusted him with every repair, every key, and every private routine. A senior footman arrived with 2 uniformed constables. Their captain, Mr. Rook, removed his hat and bowed to Richard. Your Grace, we received your warrant concerning the relief fraud. My men are prepared to arrest Samuel Price and the northern tenants named in the schedule. Eleanor saw the folded list in his hand. Vale had claimed the arrest order lacked an attached schedule, but another copy had already been delivered to the constables. Do not execute that warrant, she said. The evidence was fabricated, and the man who delivered it has assaulted a servant and abducted Lady Beatrice. Captain Rook hesitated, looking to Richard. The decision belonged to the Duke, whose name and seal appeared on the document. Richard accepted the warrant and studied the list. These are the same tenants marked on Vale's canal map. Yes, Eleanor said, because the arrests were designed to remove them from their farms before they could challenge the sale. The warrant bears my lawful signature. Then revoke it. Richard's fingers tightened around the paper. If I revoke it tonight, and the fraud proves genuine, every draft drawn against the estate may be challenged. Creditors will claim I obstructed an inquiry to protect my wife. Ashbourne could lose access to the banks before morning. Eleanor stared at him. You have seen the false confession. You have seen the stolen seals and the fabricated physician's letter. Vale fired a pistol at us, and Vale will say, Nathaniel attacked him after you were discovered altering the records. He has taken Beatrice. We do not yet know whether she left willingly. The words revealed that Richard was no longer searching for truth. He was searching for a version of events that allowed him to avoid public ruin. Eleanor had seen him do it in smaller matters throughout their marriage. When a steward blamed a tenant for missing grain, when Vale accused Samuel of copying letters, when Beatrice suggested Eleanor's questions were acts of disloyalty, Richard believed delay was wisdom whenever justice threatened his position, yet called it decisiveness when punishment fell upon someone weaker. Those families gathered at the church because I warned them, Eleanor said. If armed constables arrive before dawn, frightened men may resist. Someone will be killed. Richard turned to Captain Rook. You will not arrest the tenants tonight. Surround the church and prevent anyone from leaving until I examine the records. Eleanor's relief lasted only a second. They are not prisoners. They are witnesses in a ducal inquiry. They include children, elderly women, and families driven from flooded homes. Then, they will remain safely inside the church, under armed guard. Richard did not answer her. Captain Rook waited for a direct command. Nathaniel wrote in his notebook and held the page before his brother. Revoke it. Richard read the words, folded the original warrant, and placed it inside his coat. I will suspend the arrests, not revoke them. Then he pointed at Samuel's knife. But Price must be detained for questioning. If he is at the church, take him separately and bring him here. No, Eleanor said. Richard's eyes hardened. His knife was found beside a missing woman, because Vale placed it there. Samuel is the only former clerk who may identify the bank drafts, so Vale needs him discredited or dead. Then custody will protect him. Your custody did not protect the guard outside this room. Richard's face flushed. Enough. I will not allow you to countermand me before my officers. He took a pen from the side table and wrote a supplemental instruction across the bottom of the warrant. Captain Rook sanded the ink, folded the paper, and departed with one constable. Eleanor watched the corridor swallow them and understood that Richard had reached the same crossroads for the third time that evening. He had been given evidence, warning, and a clear alternative. He had chosen his reputation again. If harm comes to Samuel, she said, it will not be Vale's decision alone. Richard set down the pen. I am attempting to preserve this estate. No. You are preserving your authority over the people Vale intends to destroy. A servant announced that the palace gates had been searched. Vale was not among the guests, and one horse was missing from the western stable. Richard ordered riders sent toward every road. Eleanor went to the ballroom, where the guests still waited beneath extinguished chandeliers and guttering candles. Rumours moved through them before she entered. Some believed Beatrice had been murdered. Others claimed Eleanor and Nathaniel had conspired to seize control of Ashbourne. Vale's accusation was already spreading without him. Eleanor crossed to the musician's platform and lifted the conductor's small wooden hammer. She struck it against the music stand until the room fell silent. A crime has been committed against the tenants of this estate, she announced. Money intended for their survival was stolen, their records were falsified, and warrants were prepared to remove them from their homes. The Duke has suspended the arrests while the evidence is examined. Richard entered as she spoke. His expression warned her to stop, but she continued. Every person in this ballroom witnessed my accusation. Therefore, every person will also witness this. I deny it entirely. I will not sign a confession. I will not surrender my records, and I will not permit an innocent clerk to bear the punishment for a scheme created within this palace. Lady Morton, an elderly widow whose lands bordered Ashbourne, stepped forward. Your Grace, are we being asked to remain as witnesses or prisoners? Eleanor looked to Richard. He could publicly support the inquiry she had demanded, correct the humiliation he had inflicted, and order Samuel protected rather than arrested. You will remain as my guests, he said, until my officers determine whether the Duchess's claims are credible. A visible change passed through the crowd. He had placed her truth beneath the judgment of the very officials operating under his false warrant. Eleanor felt the final thread of her marriage give way. She removed the Ashbourne emeralds from her throat and placed them upon the music stand. Then, I will conduct my own inquiry, outside your control. Richard stared at the necklace. You cannot leave while the warrant remains active. I am not asking your permission. As my wife, you reside under my protection. Protection does not begin after public degradation and disappear whenever evidence becomes inconvenient. Eleanor turned to Nathaniel. Can you ride? He nodded once. Richard stepped between them and the ballroom doors. If you leave this palace, I will treat it as flight from an accusation. Eleanor met his gaze. Then accuse me again. This time, I shall ensure the whole county hears the evidence before you pronounce me guilty. She walked past him. Nathaniel followed. No servant attempted to stop them. In the carriage court, the flood bell continued to sound across the fields. Eleanor chose 2 fresh horses and sent a stable boy ahead by the southern path, with instructions for Reverend Hale to hide Samuel before the constables arrived. She had just placed one foot in the stirrup when a rider appeared beyond the gates, racing toward the palace. It was the younger stable boy she had sent to the church. He nearly fell from the saddle before reaching them. "Your Grace," he gasped. The constables arrived before me. Mr. Vale was already there, wearing the Duke's seal. He ordered the church locked. Eleanor gripped the saddle. "Where is Samuel?" The boy's face went white. Vale took him to the old canal warehouse. He said the Duke had ordered an execution at dawn. Eleanor mounted before the stable boy finished speaking. Nathaniel pulled himself into the saddle beside her despite the pain in his leg, and together they rode toward the abandoned canal warehouse as the first grey line of morning appeared beyond the eastern fields. Behind them, Richard shouted for horses and armed men, but Eleanor did not slow. The shortest road crossed the northern farms, where families now stood crowded behind the locked doors of St. Matthew's Church. Constables surrounded the churchyard with muskets, while children watched from the windows. Eleanor drew rein only long enough to call to Captain Rook. "Vale possesses a stolen private seal. Any instruction delivered by him after midnight is false." Rook looked toward the folded warrant in his hand. His order to remove Price carried the same seal as the Duke's warrant, because both were prepared by the same man. "Until His Grace revokes the warrant, I cannot release these people." Eleanor wanted to argue, but every minute spent at the church shortened Samuel's life. "Then keep your men outside," she said. "No one enters, no one fires, and no family is separated." Richard arrived moments later with 6 riders. "Release the children and suspend every order carrying my private seal," he commanded. Captain Rook stiffened. "Your Grace, the magistrate has already received copies of the fraud allegations. He ordered us to preserve all suspects until the hearing." Richard's face changed. He had believed his title could undo in one sentence what his signature had created, but the warrant had entered the county's legal machinery. The magistrate could not simply ignore accusations involving stolen relief funds and forged estate accounts, because the Duke regretted authorizing them. "I am the complainant," Richard said, "and your wife is the accused." Rook replied carefully. "Until the magistrate hears both sides, I must obey his written instruction." Eleanor saw the first real consequence of Richard's decision settle upon him. He had surrendered control the moment he made a public accusation and signed an arrest order without examining its foundation. His authority had created the danger, but it could no longer end it. "The hearing is at noon," Rook added. "If the Duchess fails to appear, the magistrate may issue a warrant for her as well." "Then I shall appear," Eleanor said, "after Samuel is safe." She rode on. The canal warehouse stood beside a drained basin half a mile north of the church. It had been abandoned when Parliament rejected the original navigation proposal, but Vale's new map showed that the building would become the central toll office if the canal sale proceeded. 2 constables guarded the road. When Eleanor approached, they crossed their muskets. "No entry, by order of the Duke." Richard rode forward. "I am the Duke." The men exchanged uncertain glances. One produced a note carrying Richard's private seal and dated 20 minutes earlier. It ordered that no one, including members of the Ashcombe family, be admitted until the prisoner's confession was secured. Vale had anticipated Richard's attempt to reclaim control and used his stolen authority against him. "Stand aside," Richard said. The older constable shook his head. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace. We were warned that Lord Nathaniel might force you to contradict your own orders." "Mr. Vale said your safety depended upon obedience." Nathaniel's face hardened. The lie was effective because Richard had allowed Vale to present Nathaniel's isolation as madness for years. Eleanor looked beyond the guards. Smoke rose from the warehouse chimney, though no grain had been stored there since the floods. A cart stood near the rear door, loaded with iron tools and barrels of lamp oil. She recognized 3 fresh wheel tracks leading from the warehouse toward the unfinished canal cut. "He is not preparing an execution," she said. "He is destroying the basin." Richard looked at the cart. "Why?" "Because the warehouse contains the original survey records and contractor marks. If the basin collapses, he can blame the tenants for sabotaging the project and bury the documents beneath it. The floodwater held behind the temporary northern embankment would rush through the canal cut and strike the lower farms. Vale would erase his evidence while creating the violent resistance needed to justify permanent evictions." Eleanor turned to the constables. "If you continue obeying his order, dozens of people may drown." The younger man lowered his musket, but the older one remained uncertain. "We require proof." A bell rang from inside the warehouse. Once, twice. Samuel's voice followed, muffled but unmistakable. Run! The powder is beneath the western wall. Eleanor kicked her horse forward. The younger constable moved aside. The older reached for her bridle, but Nathaniel struck his arm with the cane and cleared the road. They crossed the yard as a shot shattered the window above them. Vale appeared briefly behind the glass, then vanished. Richard and his riders followed. The warehouse doors had been chained from within. Eleanor dismounted and examined the outer wall. The wheel tracks ended beside a narrow sluice channel where workers had once moved water into the basin. Vale had placed powder along the western supports, but the explosion alone would not release the flood. Someone had already opened the old control gate uphill. Eleanor heard the low, growing roar before anyone else understood it. The water is coming. Richard ordered his men to break the doors. Eleanor ran toward the sluice mechanism beside the warehouse. Its iron wheel had rusted, but the chain was new. Vale had replaced it, using money disguised as canal expenses. If we close this gate, can we stop the flood? Richard asked. Not from here. This wheel controls only the warehouse channel. The main gate is half a mile north. Then I will send riders. They will not reach it in time. Eleanor studied the numbers stamped on the new chain links. Vale had ordered a chain strong enough to hold the gate against 6 feet of water, but he had used the same calculations she created for grain-lifting pulleys. She knew the load limit because the numbers were hers. Bring the carriage horses and every length of rope, she ordered. We cannot stop the water, but we can redirect the force. Richard began to question her, then stopped. For once, he obeyed without demanding an explanation. Eleanor looped ropes through the warehouse sluice wheel and attached them to 4 horses. If they opened the side channel fully, part of the flood would enter the empty basin rather than the farms. The water would destroy the warehouse, but it might spare the cottages below. The evidence is inside, Richard said. So are Samuel and Beatrice. Then we free them before the water arrives. Nathaniel smashed a lower window and climbed through despite his injured leg. Eleanor followed. The warehouse was filled with smoke and the bitter scent of powder. Samuel hung from a roof beam with a rope around his wrists. Beatrice lay unconscious beside a stack of survey chests. Vale stood on the upper gallery holding a torch. Sign the confession, he called, and I will tell you which powder line is false. Eleanor saw 4 black cords running across the floor toward the western wall. Only one carried a faint dusting of fresh powder. The other 3 were stained with soot to deceive them. You need my confession because Richard's warrant cannot transfer the tenant leases, she said. You require proof that they conspired with me. Vale lowered the torch toward the cords. You have 1 minute. Outside, the approaching water sounded like thunder. Richard entered through the broken window and saw Beatrice on the floor. Vale smiled down at him. Order your wife to sign. You have always found public pressure effective. Richard looked at Eleanor, and for the first time, there was no command in his face, only the horror of understanding how thoroughly Vale had studied and exploited his worst instincts. Eleanor seized a grain hook and cut Samuel's rope. Nathaniel dragged Beatrice toward the window. I will sign nothing, Eleanor said. Then they all die because of your pride, Vale replied. No, Richard said. He stepped into the open space beneath the gallery. They are in danger because of mine. Vale threw the torch. Richard caught the burning end against his coat and fell, smothering it beneath his body before it reached the powder line. The horses outside strained against the ropes. The sluice wheel began to turn. Water burst through the eastern channel, tearing boards from the warehouse floor. Eleanor and Nathaniel pulled Samuel and Beatrice through the window, while Richard staggered after them with one sleeve burned black. Vale escaped across the upper gallery toward the roof. Seconds later, the flood struck the western wall. The building groaned, then collapsed into the empty basin. Survey chests, ledgers, and beams disappeared beneath the violent water. The side channel had diverted enough force to spare the nearest farms, but the warehouse and almost every original document inside it was gone. Richard stood in the mud watching years of records vanish because he had given Vale control of the project and silenced the wife who questioned its accounts. Samuel coughed beside Eleanor and pressed something small into her hand. It was a brass bank token, marked with the number 17. Vale kept the drafts in a private box at Northshire Bank, he whispered. This opens the drawer, but the bank closes its records when the noon hearing begins. Eleanor looked toward the rising sun. They had less than 6 hours to reach the bank, authenticate the drafts, and return before the magistrate judged her absence as flight. Then Samuel gripped her wrist. There is something else. The largest payment was not collected by Vale or Lady Beatrice. His eyes moved toward Richard. It was collected under the Duke's own name. Richard's head lifted sharply. That is impossible. Samuel was still coughing mud and smoke from his lungs, but his answer came clearly. The draft for £300 was endorsed Richard Ashcombe, Duke of Ashbourne. I copied it myself before Mr. Vale dismissed me. Did you see who presented it? Eleanor asked. No. The bank sent the endorsed draft back with the monthly packet. Vale removed it before the accounts reached the Duchess. Richard looked toward the ruins of the warehouse. If the signature is mine, the magistrate will believe I received the stolen money. That is what Vale intends, Eleanor said. If his scheme fails, you become its public author. For years, Richard had treated Vale's obedience as loyalty, never realizing the secretary had been constructing a chain of evidence that ended at the Duke. Every careless signature and unread document now made Richard both the source of authority and the perfect scapegoat. Eleanor closed her fingers around the brass token. Samuel, can you ride? Then you will come to the bank and identify the drawer. Nathaniel will accompany us. Richard stepped closer. I am coming. No. Take Beatrice to the church and order a physician to examine her in front of witnesses. Revoke the arrest warrant publicly, not merely in a private instruction. The bank will not release a ducal draft without me. It may refuse to release it with you present if the draft names you as the collector. Your arrival could be called an attempt to suppress evidence. Richard's burned sleeve hung open, exposing reddened skin beneath it. He looked exhausted, but Eleanor felt no temptation to soften the truth for him. If you wish to help, she continued, go before the tenants you accused and admit that Vale acted through powers you granted him. Then bring the magistrate to the bank. No soldiers, no private guards, and no demand that the records be surrendered to you. You are setting terms for my participation in my own defense. I am setting terms for cooperation in mine. Richard looked at Nathaniel, perhaps expecting his brother to object. Nathaniel simply opened his notebook and wrote, "Accept them." Richard folded the page and placed it inside his coat. Very well. Eleanor watched him lift Beatrice into a carriage. He did not ask for forgiveness or declare that one dangerous act at the warehouse had repaired the cruelty of the ballroom. He rode toward the church, carrying the first burden she had required of him, the truth spoken before those with the least power to demand it. Eleanor, Nathaniel, and Samuel took the southern road to Northshire. The journey required 2 changes of horses, and every mile reminded Eleanor how little remained under her legal control. Richard had transferred her household authority, frozen the relief fund, and allowed public allegations to attach themselves to her name. Even if the magistrate cleared her, she could not return to the life she had occupied the day before. A wife's reputation could be destroyed by suspicion long after evidence vanished. Yet Eleanor still possessed something Vale had underestimated: relationships built without command. At the first coaching inn, the owner recognized her and provided fresh horses before she could offer payment. His sister's farm had survived the floods because of Eleanor's grain plan. At the toll road, a carter who once received medicine from her relief committee guided them around a collapsed bridge. Every quiet act Richard had dismissed as household management now became a road beyond his control. They reached Northshire Bank shortly after 9. The manager, Mr. Wilcox, refused to open private drawer 17 until Eleanor placed the brass token on his desk and Samuel described the contents sealed inside. The drawer belongs to Northmere Surveying, Wilcox said. Its registered representative is Mr. Silas Vale. Then the token proves we have access, not ownership, Eleanor replied. Do not surrender the contents to us. Open the drawer before witnesses, record every item, and keep them under bank custody until the magistrate arrives. Wilcox studied her smoke-stained gown and Nathaniel's injured leg. The Duke sent instructions last week that all canal records were to be released only to his secretary. His secretary is wanted for abduction, attempted murder, theft, and use of a stolen seal. Do you possess a warrant? Not yet. Wilcox pushed the token back across the desk. Then I cannot act. Eleanor had expected resistance. She removed the copied canal agreement saved from the library and placed it beside the token. This document promises your bank repayment from canal tolls. If the associated drafts are fraudulent, your security may be worthless. You have a financial interest in preserving the drawer before its representative removes the contents. Wilcox read the agreement and reached the final page. His expression sharpened. This copy lacks the bank's countersignature, because Vale intended the estate to believe the bank had approved the loan, and the bank to believe the estate had approved the security. Compare the registration number with your agreement book. Wilcox summoned his chief clerk. Minutes later, they returned with a heavy volume. The registration number belonged not to a canal loan, but to an expired wool contract. Vale had inserted a genuine bank reference into a false agreement, counting on Richard never checking the second page. Wilcox locked the doors and called 2 clerks as witnesses. Drawer 17 contained 12 bank drafts, a packet of forged tenant statements, the missing private seal, and a narrow book recording payments to Vale, Beatrice, and several false companies. The largest draft bore Richard's name, but Eleanor saw immediately that the endorsement had been formed differently from his normal signature. Richard began the letter R with a long upward stroke and ended Ashcombe by crossing the final E beneath the line. This endorsement began with a loop and ended above it. "It is forged," Samuel said. Vale practiced the Duke's signature for months. Eleanor examined the draft without touching it. The handwriting is not Vale's. The same rounded letters appeared on the false confession prepared for her. Beatrice had written both. Vale provided the plan and access, but Beatrice had forged the Duke's endorsement to direct suspicion toward Richard if necessary. Wilcox entered each item in a custody register, then sealed the drawer contents inside a bank chest. Eleanor asked Samuel and both clerks to sign across the paper seals. She added her signature last, without using any Ashbourne stamp. The proof now belonged to a witness chain no private order could erase. Richard arrived near 10, with the magistrate, Reverend Hale, Captain Rook, and 6 tenant representatives. He entered without escort and placed the original arrest warrant on Wilcox's desk. "I revoke this accusation completely," he said. "I signed it without reading the supporting schedule, ignored my wife's request for examination, and allowed my authority to be used against innocent families." The tenants stood in silence. Richard's confession did not restore their trust, but it shifted the risk onto himself where it belonged. The magistrate examined the bank register and ordered the chest conveyed under guard to the noon hearing at St. Matthew's Church. Beatrice, now conscious, had been placed in Reverend Hale's care. She refused to speak except to accuse Vale of threatening her life. As the witnesses prepared to depart, Richard approached Eleanor. "I saw the church records," he said quietly. 27 families remained because you guaranteed the grain purchases from your own marriage settlement income. Eleanor had never told him. He had assumed the relief fund came entirely from estate rents. "The northern account was short after the floods," she replied. "The families could not wait for Parliament or your creditors. You risked your private income while I accused you of taking mine. I protected people who would otherwise have starved. I did not do it to earn your gratitude." Richard lowered his eyes. "I know." It was the first apology he offered, without asking her to relieve him of its weight. But before they could leave for the hearing, a crash sounded from the records chamber. Smoke rolled beneath the locked door. Wilcox seized the key, yet the lock would not turn. Through the glass panel, Eleanor saw a clerk lying unconscious on the floor and the bank chest missing from the evidence table. The rear window stood open. On its sill rested the brass token marked 17. Vale had entered the bank while every witness watched Richard confess, and he had taken the only complete proof with less than 2 hours remaining before Eleanor's hearing. Wilcox ordered the bank doors barred, but Eleanor knew Vale was already beyond them. The rear window opened onto a narrow alley leading to the river road, where a carriage could disappear among market traffic within minutes. Captain Rook searched the records chamber and found a clerk's coat missing, along with a blank book of bank receipts. Vale had entered disguised as an employee, struck the real clerk, and carried the chest out beneath the bank's own canvas cover. "We still possess the custody register," Wilcox said. 4 witnesses recorded every item. "You recorded descriptions," the magistrate replied. "Not the full contents. Without the drafts, the defense may argue that the signatures were misread or that the items were placed in the drawer by someone seeking to implicate Mr. Vale. Samuel's face fell. He had risked his life to identify the drawer, but his testimony alone could now be dismissed as revenge from a former clerk. Richard sent riders to the River Road, the London Road, and every bridge within 10 miles. Eleanor remained beside the open window, studying the brass token Vale had left behind. He had not dropped it during his escape. It rested precisely at the center of the sill, polished side upward. "He wants us to follow the chest," she said. Nathaniel wrote in his notebook, "Because it will be destroyed, or because it contains what he wants us to find." Eleanor returned to Wilcox's office. "When your clerks opened drawer 17, did anyone examine the underside of the drafts?" Wilcox shook his head. "Only the endorsements and amounts. Vale had allowed them to discover the drawer. Samuel escaped the warehouse with the token too easily, and the bank chest had been left intact long enough for witnesses to list its contents. Vale knew Eleanor would follow a clear account trail. The chest might contain forged evidence within forged evidence, a second layer, designed to survive his disappearance and condemn someone else. The largest draft, named Richard, Eleanor said. The handwriting resembled Beatrice's. Yet Vale knew we had Beatrice alive. He would never depend upon a forgery she could deny under oath. Richard understood. The documents were meant to lead to me. Yes, if the chest is recovered, burned or abandoned, enough of your name may remain to support the accusation, while the details proving forgery vanish. The magistrate looked toward the clock. The hearing begins in 90 minutes. I will postpone for 1 hour due to the theft. No longer. The tenants remain under legal suspicion, and the county requires an answer. They returned to St. Matthew's Church, under a sky darkening with rain. Word of the warehouse collapse and the stolen bank chest had already spread. Villagers filled the graveyard, while the guests from Ashbourne Palace arrived in carriages to witness the proceeding. Vale's final attack awaited them on the church door. A printed notice had been nailed above the handle, bearing Eleanor's supposed confession. It declared that she had diverted £900 to incite tenants against her husband and had used Nathaniel's affection to escape punishment. At the bottom appeared her copied signature and the Ashbourne seal. Dozens of identical notices had been distributed through the village. Women who once thanked Eleanor for food now looked at her with frightened uncertainty. Men whispered that Nathaniel's appearance at the ball had been planned as part of an adulterous conspiracy. Vale had joined financial fraud to sexual scandal, knowing society would examine Eleanor's conduct more eagerly than his accounts. Richard tore the notice from the door. "This is a lie. It carries your seal," a creditor called from the crowd, as did the arrest warrant. "The seal was stolen after you accused your wife publicly and transferred her authority to another woman. Convenient." Richard stood beneath the church arch as his own choices returned in every skeptical face. If he defended Eleanor now, people would say he acted from shame or jealousy. If he remained silent, the forged confession would become accepted truth. He could no longer lend her credibility because he had spent his credibility destroying hers. Inside the church, Beatrice sat beside Reverend Hale with a bandage around her temple. When Eleanor approached, she turned away. "Vale tried to kill you twice," Eleanor said. "Your silence will not purchase safety. If I testify, my father loses the canal agreement, and my family is ruined. Vale has already chosen Richard as his scapegoat. Do you believe he preserved your name out of tenderness?" Beatrice's mouth trembled. "I did not steal the relief money. No, you forged the endorsement and gave Vale access to my rooms. Because Richard promised." She stopped. Eleanor waited. "What did he promise?" "Nothing," Beatrice whispered. "Vale said Richard would seek a separation after your disgrace. He said the court would accept me once the theft became public." Eleanor looked across the church at her husband. Richard heard the exchange. The pain on his face was real, but so was the knowledge that he had behaved in a manner that made Vale's promise believable. He had elevated Beatrice, surrendered Eleanor's keys, and humiliated his wife before society. Whether or not he intended remarriage, he created the expectation upon which the conspiracy depended. The magistrate opened the hearing. Vale did not appear, but a solicitor entered on his behalf and submitted copies of the canal agreement, the confession, and the draft bearing Richard's name. Without the originals, both sides possessed only competing copies and wounded witnesses. The solicitor argued that Eleanor had manipulated Samuel and Nathaniel, destroyed the warehouse to erase her fraud, and invented Vale's escape after he discovered her conspiracy. Then he called Captain Rook, who confirmed that Richard's original warrant accused Eleanor and the tenants of theft. Every careless act by the Duke strengthened Vale's defense. When the magistrate asked Richard whether he had believed his wife guilty at the time he signed, the church became utterly silent. Richard could protect his title by saying the evidence had reasonably convinced him and blaming Vale for everything that followed. Instead, he stood before the tenants, creditors, servants, and guests who had watched the ballroom humiliation. "I believed what preserved my pride," he said. "My wife asked me to compare the ledger with the grain invoices. I refused. She warned me that Vale controlled the evidence. I silenced her. I signed the canal agreement without reading it, authorized arrests without examining the schedule, transferred her household powers to Lady Beatrice, and publicly declared her dishonorable before she had been heard. Mr. Vale exploited my authority, but I gave it to him willingly." The solicitor rose. "Your Grace, I advise you to consider the consequences of that statement." Richard did not look at him. "I have considered them too late." He removed the ducal signet from his hand and placed it before the magistrate. "Until this inquiry concludes, I surrender control of the canal lands and estate accounts to independent trustees. I will personally guarantee every relief payment and compensate any tenant detained under my warrant." A murmur moved through the church. The admission threatened his credit, his political standing, and his control of Ashbourne. It did not prove Eleanor innocent, but it destroyed Vale's strongest protection, the Duke's desire to avoid shame. The magistrate granted them one final hour to produce decisive evidence. Eleanor sat in the vestry with the burned silver ledger clasp, the brass token, the custody register, and the printed confession spread before her. Nearly everything else had vanished. Nathaniel watched as she turned the clasp over. Its engraved initials had blackened in the account's fire, but a thin line of blue sealing wax remained inside the cut hinge. Eleanor froze. Estate documents used red wax. The bank drawer had been sealed with blue. The clasp had not merely been planted beside the strongbox, it had been used to carry a thin impression of the bank's private verification mark. Vale cut the hinge so the hidden inner surface could press wax without exposing the engraved face. That was how he forged the bank countersignature on the false canal agreement. She placed the clasp beside the brass token and saw matching scratches along their edges. Both objects had been held in the same small copying press. Vale had left the token because he believed it proved only that drawer 17 had been opened. Instead, it linked his bank access directly to the physical evidence used to accuse Eleanor. Yet a matching scratch could be dismissed as coincidence, unless Vale demonstrated knowledge only the forger possessed. Eleanor looked at the printed confession again. It claimed she had hidden the stolen funds beneath the northern sluice wheel. No witness had mentioned a location, and the warehouse was now underwater. "He expects us to search the basin," she said. Nathaniel leaned closer. Eleanor folded the confession and rose. "We will announce that the bank chest has been recovered from beneath the sluice wheel, and that one draft survived, with a verification error." Nathaniel understood. Vale would have to correct the supposed error or destroy the recovered draft. Either act would reveal knowledge unavailable to an innocent secretary. Eleanor picked up the silver clasp. "He forced me to dance for an audience once. Now we shall give him an audience of his own."